those of you who weren't, welcome, and we are glad to have you here. So, thank you to all the volunteers. Anyone who's wearing one of those yellow armbands you see walking around, they've done a lot of planning to make this all happen, so they've been working very hard to make this great event happen. Second of all, after you hear the talks today, make sure you walk around and take a look at all the posters hanging around. The Choteau 5th grade class worked very hard putting together these science projects, all focused on migration. They got a lot of help from people on the Wild Wings Committee, and those kids put a lot of work into that, so make sure you check that out as well. I have been asked to let people know that if you want to get on the van tours going out to Freeze Out tomorrow morning at the door, they've got a sign-up sheet there just so they know how many vehicles and how many people to be expecting tomorrow morning. That does leave from here at 6:30 a.m. That is leaving here at 6:30 a.m. to catch the birds. So we've also got some other people to thank. All of our sponsors for supporting the event. We've got Montana Wildlife Federation, Sun River Watershed Group, Ducks Unlimited, Montana Dinosaur Center, Boone and Crockett Club, Montana Avon, Sporting Lead Free, and Montana Wetlands and Waterfowl. And of course we've got Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So again, a big thank you to all of those people for helping support this event. Just for people that aren't driving in the caravan, you know, if you're going out to Freeze Out Lake to be looking at the birds and enjoying it out there, make sure that you're driving safely. Be sure pull-outs that are along the roads. Don't be stopping in the roads. Amazing, that has happened in the past. So just make sure that you're getting off the roadway, getting into a safe pull-out, and being safe out there. So I hope everyone has had an opportunity to look at the raffle items. They're over in the back corner there. Just be sure to get your tickets in. Those will be drawn after the talks. So we were supposed to have State Representative Tyson Running Wolf out here. Unfortunately, he had a last-minute emergency, so he's not going to be joining us. Filling his place, we will have an impromptu talk from Jim Robbins. Those of you who were here last night saw his talk, a little more off the cuff and answering more questions. But he is a wildlife scientific journalist, and he was a great speaker last night, so we'll be happy to hear more from him. But first, we are going to have Dr. Stella Kosha from Montana Tech. She's with the biology department at Montana Tech. So her work, her presentation is going to be avian evolution from feathered ancestors to Freeze Out Lake. So anyone who was here last year might recognize her. She gave a great talk last year, and we're very excited to have her back. Her work as an associate professor focuses mainly on human dimensions of wildlife management and the human-animal relationship. Her current research looks at trends in waterfowl migration and is helping to develop an updated mitigation plan for the Berkeley pit. So she also studies social dynamics of urban chickens and how that can result in exposure to disease. All right, Stella.
Thank you all very much for being here. A huge shout out to Nancy, Connie, and Aaron. And this is just the start of the list. The volunteers and the effort is huge. So it never hurts to get another round of applause. The Twitters, for everybody that made this happen. I understand that there are people here who drove in from Florida. Are y'all here? My Florida people? Maybe? Okay. And there are 2 Rhode Islanders here. No Rhode from Colorado. Colorado person, all right. I knew that. But I know that a lot of people made a major effort to get here. A lot of people made a major effort to facilitate this. And we are all looking forward to having it grow year after year. So this is fantastic. You're looking at a fella, this is Evan Andrews. Maybe that's not the best free shot of him there. Why on earth would Evan Andrews from Ninja Warriors be up there? And I want to spend a little bit of time, I'm going to explain that in a minute, but Evan is going to play a little bit of a role here. I also want to give a shout out to Jim. I thought I saw you around. Giving a talk for, there you are, giving a talk for evolution. I started my original piece on the evolution of flight. And when I joined the talk with Jim yesterday, I thought, all right, we're going to have a little bit of a redo. So there's going to be some overlap. We're going to reinforce what Jim talked about, and we're going to focus a little bit more on what makes birds birds, and then bring it all into freeze out. So hopefully that will be a roadmap. The other thing is, as I look around, we've got a range of expertise, and so what I tried to do is put together some information that speaks to different people on different intellectual levels. Keep in mind that some of the best birders might be lawyers, and they might be plumbers, and some of the most educated people might be terrible birders. So everybody has their own unique piece of knowledge. I tell people that come to the university, you know, our chancellor has a PhD, but he can't tell the difference between a duck and a swan. So that's kind of the approach that I take with birding, is hopefully I'll provide, or this kind of material, hopefully I'll be able to provide something for everybody. And starting in the middle. So I don't know if any of y'all recognize this image here. Can y'all see in the back, in the distances? One more round of... Okay, all right. I love this image. This is, I believe, the image of the year, the Audubon image of the year from Christopher Jobson in 2020. And this is a kingfisher nosediving straight into a glass lake. Kingfishers, they will dive in, they will grab a fish, and then they on the side of a fence post or a rock, and will consume their prey. And this, to me, is just the perfect image of what we know and what we think we know, and bird activity right caught in action in a precision point in time. And it's just being able to catch this kind of an image is really fantastic. No lecture would be complete without a nod to Gary Larson from the far side. He did science comedy here, and this says, it's a little fuzzy at the bottom. Great moments in evolution, and it's three fish playing baseball, and the ball has gone up onto the shore, and now they have to figure out how they're going to get it down. Home run, exactly. So I want to talk about, I'm going to give you a little bit of a homework here, a little bit of a challenge here. I want to talk about principles in natural selection, and I want to talk about concepts in evolution. This is an image of finches, Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, and the bird has really been the icon of evolutionary change, not the least of which these finches that come out of this island biogeography, where these animals, these finches, all evolve slightly differently in the same habitat to take advantage of different resources. And so there are a principle and a concept that I want you to just kind of to hold close to you as we move through this. So the principles in natural selection is that there's variation in every population. There's variation in every population. So if we were to have a murder of ravens out there, we could look out there and say that they all look just about identical. But if we were to capture those ravens, and I were to give Julie a raven, and Mike a raven, and Jim a raven, you might notice notice that the weight of one raven is a little more than the other, that the build depth of Mike's raven might be a little bit more so than that of Bonnie's raven. That the wingspan may be slightly different from each one to the next. In fact, I would hope that that would be what you would expect rather than 4 or 5 ravens all identical and think that they look exactly the same. Variation exists in every population. A population produces more than can survive. So those that survive kind of think of fun. So those are our principles of natural selection. Variation exists in every population. Population produces more than can survive, and those that survive go on to pass their traits on. And that brings us to the concept the environment does not create the change, it retains it. The environment does not create the change, it retains it. So a bird that has more melanin at the tips of its wings may have the slight advantage in migration over one that has less melanin, and that success leads to reproduction, and that trait is passed on. The environment did not create that change, the environment retained it. That change was already there, that difference was already there. Individuals don't evolve, you come back to a population of different individuals. They will reflect the change that the environment has retained, but the individuals can change, you can have adaptations. I talk about adaptations referring to my dog. I have a sweet little dog, she's 14 years old, she's from East Africa, greyhound. This dog, despite her short coat, never shed. Poor soul to Montana, and it got cold, and she went, I'm like, look at that, you have an undercoat. And she started to shed every spring like every other dog. She had to evolve, she adapted to the environment. Okay? Principles of natural selection works like a filter. Concepts in evolution, the change is already there. It's the environment that retains it, and we see that change in future populations. So I want you to hold on to those, because they're different. We used to think that if the giraffe reached, the next offspring would have longer necks. In fact, it's the giraffe that had the best reach, that had the most calories, offspring. In order to reproduce, you have to be alive. So let's talk about how all that works. We're going to switch back to birds a little bit here. Not a little bit, for the rest of the time. We're going to focus mainly on birds. And a little bit on dinosaurs. And I have to say, no better place to talk about evolution of birds from dinosaurs to Snokies than in Choteau. Holy cow. So, our evolutionary trend started with the movement of these large reptile-based dinosaurs. Dinosaur literally means large lizard. And as we move through the evolution of dinosaurs, we get these branches about the nesting dolls. I don't know if any of y'all had those nesting dolls growing Asia, Russian nesting dolls. But think about maybe it being the opposite, right? Where with each doll that comes out of the next layer, the possibility. And so as you move through this evolutionary trend, what's happening here, this animal that relies on, it's called quadrupedal, right? So we all have 4 limbs, but it's 4-limbed walking, so it's quadrupedal. Here now we have a body move upright. Then we have elongated S-shaped neck, so we have the ability to do this. Now this starts out as a random genetic modification. Just like some of us have longer fingernails, longer fingers, slightly better changes, surviving make the difference. We move up here and we see wrist bones, and suddenly right in here we see feathers start to evolve, start to show up on the scene. And we have a bird, dinosaur-like thing called Archaeopteryx. And I know Jim talked a little bit about Archaeopteryx yesterday. Archaeopteryx is classified in the dinosaurs, but it's feathered, and it came from a fossil. And people looking at this fossil, suddenly they're having a senior moment. The major connection, right? The missing link of making the jump from dinosaurs to birds. We then have two branches of birds. We have paleognaths and neognath. Gnath means mouth. So if you think about a dog that gnaws on a bone, or a gnat that bites you, G-N-A is mouth. So we're thinking about old mouth and new mouth birds, but that's not really where the evolution is. Before I get a little further into it, I want to think about that analogy with the nesting doll. So every time you take a nesting doll out, instead of having it be smaller, it expands into this range of possibilities. So here we have Archaeopteryx down at the bottom, and as we pull birds out, we have the appearance of over 30 modern orders of birds. What's an order? So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We're kingdom Animalia, and as we move something like vertebrates, Vertebrata is a subphylum. It's not even a formal, it is a formal classification, but it's not one of the major groups. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So here are so this is halfway between being an animal and being a mallard. And this is the range: perching birds, hummingbirds, terns, fowl, ducks and geese, all the way down to our ostriches. But if you're going to understand birds, one of the things that is important to understand is the evolution of limbs. I'm going to spend just a minute on this. The only group of animals that has greater diversity than birds is fish. Eons longer or birds, and they have an incredible amount of diversity. And as you move up the evolutionary pathway for fish, you get to Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is a missing link. Tiktaalik was discovered by Neil Shubin. He's out of Chicago. He found him in the Arctic. It is similar to Archaeopteryx in a fossilized capacity, which is quite remarkable. Fossils alone are quite remarkable because having the condition to die and be preserved, all of the conditions have to line up. With all of those birds out there, never mind the birds, how about the ravens, the squirrels, the crows, the animals that are around here? When they reach the end of their lifespan, they don't just find a place in the forest. They've become part of the natural ecosystem. Animals cycle through just like plants cycle through, and so to be able to find a perfectly preserved or a well-preserved specimen means that a lot of other conditions had to line up. One of the things that Tiktaalik had were no nares on the top of its rostrum, forward-facing eyes, and limbs that had a rotator cuff. Right? If you're a fish and your limbs, your fins on your pectoral girdle only go back like this, when you're out of water, it's not going to work very well. You need to be able to push your body up. And so that change in the pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle were instrumental in moving from your fish to an amphibian or to a land-based animal. And so from this transition, with Tiktaalik as the missing link, we went from fish to what's called tetrapods. Now, I've talked about tetrapodia, meaning walking on four limbs. Tetrapods, we are all tetrapods. We have 4 limbs, and tetrapods also have 5 digits, so we're pentadactyl. And in some cases, animals that come from 4-limbed, 5-digit ancestors lose those, like the snake, the whale, and similar. They're still tetrapods. They just don't have the legs. And that's kind of an interesting concept to get your head around. A snake is a tetrapod. It comes from four-limbed ancestors, and deep in its genetics, it has the genes that could be turned on for legs. So here is a better image of these girdles, right? This is your pectoral girdle and your pelvic girdle that give you the ability to move from water, which is buoyant, to land. Living on land is incredibly hard. Our oxygen variation is different, our temperature variation is different, our sound is different, our vision is different. Think about your body formation. And think about the ability to have your body weight, which is a wide range. You can hold your body weight upright on just the sole space of your feet. If I were to try to do that with this microphone, let's hope it's off. I'm not going to drop it, I know they're expensive, but the ability to balance bipedal is an incredible challenge in an environment like air. It's far easier to do in water. So all of these different senses had to change in order for the animals to move. Major moving means both ways of life. I hope that all amphibians in the room are over 18. But they're still tied to water. They still have part of their life cycle attached to water. Their skin is water permeable. In fact, many amphibians actually perform gas exchange through their dermal layer. Some of them perform gas exchange through their mouth cavity, their buccal cavity. They don't have the lungs, they just have the cheek pockets, and they can perform gas exchange. But they have to stay in a moist environment in order to keep from dehydrating. And their offspring, for the most part, are water-bound. There are some exceptions where frogs salamanders can lay their eggs under leaves and areas, but they cannot dry out. And so amphibians are in this fragile habitat. It's called a ribbon habitat, even though it's not necessarily narrow, though sometimes it is. It's very narrow. It's very limited. It can't be totally aquatic, and it can't be totally terrestrial. So you have to have access to water all the time. And then we move over to amniotes. Right? So we have all of our amniotes here. And an amniote includes modern reptiles, birds, and mammals. And the idea of the amniote, there's some major changes, is that they have water-resistant skin and a keratinized coating. So this is scales, hair, and feathers. They have a four-chambered heart. They have muscles and a muscularized lung system for respiration, so they can go. That's really important, especially when you're trying to breathe air. And they have amniotic fluid, and it's often called the amniotic pond. The ability to lay an egg that has water in it away from a pond. They take the pond with them. And it's really interesting. I want you to just mesmerize for a minute. When you've got an egg, maybe you're cracking it into your skillet for a sunny side up or an over medium. That egg, in 21 days, could be a chicken. Everything that egg needs to convert into a chicken is already there, except for gas exchange, what happens across the shell membrane. There's a theory in physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it merely changes form. And nothing could be more obvious about that than when you think about the egg, whether it's a chicken egg, or that of a northern pintail, or a godwit, or a bluebird, or a reptile. Everything is right there, and it just has to convert into that animal. And that component is key to moving away from water. And once the animals could move away from water, the possibilities were endless. the world was their oyster. There was unlimited habitat. And there's another saying, opportunity leads to diversity. So when there's plenty of food and plenty of shelter and plenty of reproductive opportunities and plenty of water, all of that variation in every population, can survive. Or most of that variation can survive, right? So instead of the environment acting as a filter to narrow out those that are best suited for the environment, when you have endless opportunity, like an amniote moving onto land, the environment acts like an amplifier. Every variant, or most variants, get the opportunity to survive and go on. And so this is where we get adaptive radiation. When you think about that wheel of finches that I started with, that's adaptive radiation. So all of these variants are now becoming their own unique genera or species. And that's where amniotes work. And so when we bring in the Archaeopteryx, this is the fossil, the Archaeopteryx. You can see the feathers. You can see this neck. You can see a different type of skull. Suddenly, we have the evolutionary adaptation that enables amniotes to not only take advantage of horizontal space, but now space. The Archaeopteryx was short years after Darwin's Origin of Species was published, so has hit the shape of those connections. So the idea with, let me just make sure that I'm on the right. I think I mentioned I redid this. Yeah, okay. So birds are now firmly rooted in the evolutionary history of reptiles. And reptiles are getting an evolutionary change of their own. They're no longer these scaly, cold-blooded beasts that roam the land, but many of them are thought to be feathered. Many of them are thought to be warm-blooded, endotherms. We create our own heat, just like birds. The diversity of birds is incredibly huge. So you have the bumblebee hummingbird that can sit at the end of the tip of a pencil. And you have the African ostrich, only unique in its name because of its evolutionary and extinct ancestors, that is several hundred pounds and is so large it cannot fly, but it can run 35 miles an hour and it can kick as high as the head of an elephant. You have the emperor penguin, which is actually thought to be flighted underwater. Birds inhabit all biomes, from mountains to prairies and oceans, the North Pole to the South Pole. No other group of animals does that. And so when you are mesmerized with birds, think about, give yourself credit. These animals are amazing. Some of you may have heard that I have a deep affection for pigeons. This is not necessarily something that lands well in a group of birders. Many people think that they're invasive species. They're dirty, they're rats of the sky. I want you to think about what your day would be like on an afternoon in an urban area when there are no pigeons to see. I want you to think about how the peregrine falcon might feel in the absence of pigeons. When we celebrate the return of the peregrine falcon, we must also celebrate the presence of the pigeon, though not necessarily from our origin, from this area of origin. It has filled a niche and serves a role as part of the ecosystem function. The original thought between the Paleognathe and the Neognathe is that birds first started on the ground. And that's not untrue. And then had flight. And so from flight, we got the neonaths, starting with your ground-dwelling birds to your flighted birds. And the Paleognathe, it has a unique head and mouth, but it also has a unique sternum and lacks a keel. And a keel, I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. see a lot of up-and-coming scientists in the room. Would somebody be willing to maybe help move that around? I've got a couple specimens, and you don't mind doing it? Okay. So this protrusion that you have on the front of the bird is called a keel. It's part of the breastbone, and it has evolved in response to increasingly powerful pectoral muscles. Like Jim was talking about last night, powered flight, the ability to take the wings and make that movement enough to move the body up into the air. No matter how light birds are heavy. And this keel allows for increased muscle mass. When you cut into the breast of the chicken, those are the pectoral muscles responsible for flight, and chickens don't fly. So for those of you who are hunters, or those of you who have worked with flighted birds, this pectoral muscle is that strong. It's said that if we had the strength of the pectoral muscle of a bird, that it would split our sternum in half in order to take flight. So the original hypothesis was that first paleognats were here running around, they were flight, they had feathers, reminiscent of their dinosaur ancestors, that as they began to fly, so too did the evolution of this keel, this protrusion here. Until it changed. My animation isn't working, but in 2003, Science published a paper out of Missoula studying the evolution of flight for these chicks that would run up the hay bales, as Jim was talking about last night. When they were young, they would run and then would scurry up the hay bales while they were trying to catch insects. There's also some thought that they might be trying to get away from a predator. My hypothesis is that it's probably both. There's a lot of people who think it's either or. I like to think of a multifaceted hypothesis. So this is from Ken Dial, Wing-Assisted Incline Running and the Evolution of Flight. And so by watching these young, he was able to come up with an alternative hypothesis. Birds aren't in a tree soaring down. Birds are on the ground going up. They're climbers, they're runners, they're insect hunters, they're getting away from predators, and they're successful at it. And those that got away got to do what? Reproduce. Yeah, it. They got to do it. And so they made more. And that is the principle of evolution. That's how that happens. And so when thinking about this, I want to switch gears a minute. Why do I have Evan Andrews up here? And I'm going to... Evan is a 17-year-old from Butte, Montana. His father's an orthodontist there. His mother is a therapist. She and I ride horses together. He is a camp counselor at the YMCA. Like, you've got to be a saint to be a camp counselor in the YMCA with 200 of Butte's most energetic children. And this is why. So let's take a look at why. I'm going to fast forward to a little part of Evan's competition, and I want you to think about the evolution of birds.
Honor Society and the debate team. This kid is impressive. Just 17 years old, and here he is on clockwork. Should generate some power here.
You're gonna have finesse. They're gonna use a lot of grip strength here. If you get the timing right, Matt, it's like clockwork. It just works.
Well, they don't have this in the garage, no matter how good Dad and Grandpa are.
I think you can build this, man.
Training ready. So easy to miss them here.
17 years old, I'm sure he's heard of hopscotch.
I don't know. Do 17-year-olds today grow up playing hopscotch? Maybe in
They
Montana.
play video games for watch here.
He seems to know
running up that wall, and these little tiny birds trying to get away or trying to get that insect. And I envision that's scary. I also looked at a whole bunch of wall fails that wasn't appropriate. It's really funny though. So this didn't come out until 2003, and to be honest, it didn't hit NPR, which was the animation that didn't work, until 2013. And that's really, let's face it, where we get a lot of our science and sometimes our hip-hop information. So when the reason that I point to NPR is that a lot of these hypotheses land in the scientific community, but they're not well accepted by the general public, and that's when science really starts to count. We can publish whatever we want in journals that range from Northwest American Naturalist all the way up to Science and Nature. But unless we in this room are reading them, they're just sitting there in the pages of some dusty manual that's on a shelf in my office, and one day I'm going to have to clean out. Okay? So I encourage you to read these articles, but I also, not only for your own benefit, but for this benefit. Right? Everybody in here has, contribution to science by learning about it, challenging it. Sometimes science is wrong. Science is changing all the time. And so I really encourage people to read this material, to think critically about it, own it, extrapolate it to your everyday lives, but also think about why maybe there's an alternative hypothesis. So, flight. Right? Birds are really defined by their ability to fly. And even those that don't fly are still defined and characterized within the bird group. The thought now is that birds, as flighted, then evolved a whole range of additional adaptations, and only then did some birds evolve not to fly, like the snake, who is a tetrapod but doesn't have legs. How y'all doing? These are some big concepts. So let's talk about some of those evolutionary changes of birds. So flight. In order to fly, every system in your body has to adapt to it. Vision is incredibly important. It's thought that swifts and tree swallows and cliff-dwelling birds have completely different shaped wings, not only to be able to land into their nest area, but to do so within a huge group of other flying family members. I once heard that the vision of a bird, particularly an eagle, is so good that, I'm looking for a pen. I don't have a pen, it doesn't matter. If you were to put two big pens on the ground and go up 1 mile, an eagle could tell you there are 2 of them there. That has to be incredible. And it explains it when you watch an osprey dive and catch a fish with extreme precision. The respiratory system has to meet the high oxygen demands and cool the body. The bones have to be light but rigid in an airframe. And they have to have all of these in order to meet high velocity flight. Could I grab one of this is a yellow-rumped warbler. Would you mind walking that around? It's intact, but it's dehydrated. So all the bones and feathers and dehydrated weight is there. I want you to feel how light that bird is. These feathers are keratinized. Can I grab another one? This is a chicken. You don't have to be gentle with that one. But pass that around and look at the different feathers. The primaries, the secondaries, and see how much wind that wing can pass. The feathers themselves are thought to be modifications of scales. This has a weird animation on it. They're thought to be modification of scales, and the fact that they have the individual barbules actually enhance or lighten the bird. So these birds don't have a whole lot, everything about these birds is trying to make them lighter and better insulated. It's this, and they also have a keratinized bill. I was, in my training, I was told that turtles and dolphins and octopi have beaks. Birds have bills, and it's very hard for me to switch. So birds have keratinized bills. This works as heat exchange, and it's lighter than bone. The feather itself zips together with tiny little barbules, making it both airproof and waterproof. If you ever see a bird preen, they have an oil gland right on their sacrum, and they can actually milk it. It looks like a little nipple. They can pull the oil out of it. They hold the oil in their bill, and they slick their feathers with that oil so that water rolls off a duck's back. Is that bad? They have different kinds of feathers. The fewer barbules that the feather has, the more air it can carry. And so those are the downy feathers. Those are the insulation feathers. Those are the feathers that they line their nest with. And those are the feathers that their young hatch with. And it's the goal of these feathers is to keep them warm. Your flight feathers are more robust. They're sturdier. They're not perfect for insulation. They work like a rain jacket. They're skeletons. You might have heard that birds' bones are hollow, and that's not entirely true, but it's more like they're lace-like. They're called pneumaticized, and they have all of these internal support structures. So it's not like breaking a light bulb that you would have. So imagine those people who have fine lace, and if the lace were crystallized, that's what the bones are like. As you're looking at that warbler, think about the weight of those bones and how light they are, and yet they're incredibly sturdy. Again, keep in mind that if that sternum, that protrusion, were not there, the musculature would be so strong it could split the sternum in half. That keel was not there. They also have modifications. These are fusions of the rib. This is called the unicate process, and this holds the rib bones together so that, again, as the bird's flying, it provides structural support. This is the full skeleton of a crow. It's very truncated, but it actually has all the same parts that our skeletons have, simply modified. The bird's thumb is called an alula, and it's at the very tip. That chicken wing should have it. It's 1 or 2 feathers, and it helps with direction. The alula of accipiters, your sharp-shinned hawk, your Cooper's hawk. If you've ever been in the woods and you have a bird that flies over you, it's that alula that's working actually quite in conjunction with the tail. The musculature works in what the muscle groups have opposing and opposite sets that provide support for each other. Birds don't sleep in nests, they roost. And they roost generally like this, in a squat position, or on the water. And they have a musculature and toe locking system that lines up physics perfectly so they can rest, and it distributes the weight and takes the pressure off them. Their respiratory system is incredibly specialized for flight. Not only does it have lungs, but it has air sacs. And so the bird will breathe into the lungs, and then the lungs act as, if you think about the kitchen, the first set that comes out, and then that air is passed along through the air sacs. And this is an incredibly efficient way. Not only it's storing high amounts of air and concentrating the oxygen, but also enabling the most amount of oxygen to be drawn out from these air sacs. And in many ways it works as countercurrent. So as the blood is going in one direction, the air is going in the other. And so countercurrent allows, even if you have a blood system that's saturated at 90%, it can still draw 5% oxygen out of the air. So this countercurrent, fish use it to extract oxygen. This is why an elk can stand, or a moose can stand in a river. Countercurrent is used to keep heat in the body instead of expelling it. And birds use countercurrent to get the most air, most oxygen out of their air. Their nervous system is incredibly unique as well. For flying, they have to have a large cerebellum in order to make split-second decisions, in order to support the neurological system of high vision, rapid flight, rapid muscle movement. But some birds, like your gulls and your seabirds, have to make room in that skull for salt glands to protect their brain from the salt that's dissolved in the atmosphere, or when they dive, or when they're on the water. Just having salt in the mist can risk their brain function, and so they have a specialized gland in their brain, in their skull, to protect their body systems, but most specifically their brain, and it excretes salt. Their vision, and we've talked a little bit about their vision, but their vision, many birds we are trichromatic, which means we can see red, yellow, and blue, 3 colors that can overlap and include orange and green. Not all of us are so you might be red-green colorblind. That's not being able to see those periphery colors. Birds are thought to be tetrachromatic. They have a 4th color that they can see. And a lot of this, I use the words thought to be, or we hypothesize, because our knowledge is limited to what we can experience. The rest we have to imagine. If we can't experience it, we have to imagine it and conceptualize it, but we can't know it in the way that we can on something that we experience. So this is a rendered rendered artistic rendition of what a tetrachromatic vision might be like. They're also stereoscopic, so they have stereo vision. How many people have seen a raptor sit up on a pole and do this? They're taking these images and they're layering them. And they can do it in flight, they can do it standing there, and they're stacking it. They're judging distance, and they're starting to see in 3 dimension far better than we can. This is what we think an owl might see like coming into a flight. Now I've got a picture of 2 species, a human and what I believe is a long-eared owl. Y'all might have heard that owls can see behind their backs, that they can turn their head 360 degrees, and every mother in the room wishes that we had eyes behind our head. Birds have more vertebrae in their neck, and this makes up for the fact that, I want you to just sit there for a second, keep your head stable, and just look back and forth, up and down. Birds can't do that. Birds' eyes are stable in their head, and so to compensate for that, birds have more neck vertebrae. And they have the same range of vision that we do, but we use our eyes, and they use our neck vertebrae. So I want you to stand, keep your shoulders not stand, I want you to stay sitting, keep your shoulders straight, and I want you to turn your head far to the right, and once your head is far to the right, I want you to move your eyeballs even further to the right. I want you to go as far as you can, pick a spot on the wall, and then I want you to do the same thing on your left-hand side. Turn your head, turn your head, turn your head, turn your eyeballs, and pick a spot on the wall. See if it's the same spot. How many people can see 360 degrees around their head? A couple of people still have the ability to do that. We got to practice this. It's bird yoga. Keeps flexibility in your neck and your eyeballs. They have increased number of vertebrae. Think about it as ball bearings to accommodate for the fact that their eyeballs don't move. They have a 4-chambered heart that has high energy demands. A turkey, their heart beats 93 times a minute, about what a teenage human's heart might be like at high rates of exercise. Evan's heartbeat's rating 93 times. His probably resting heartbeat's like 40. A chicken, their heart beats 250 times a minute. And a small black-capped chickadee, the champion of Montana winters, survives in part because its heart beats 500 times a minute. High energy demands, high oxygen demands, high heart rates. If anybody ever told you that you eat like a bird, it's probably because you were taking your 4th round up to the buffet. Birds' caloric demands are also incredibly high to meet these energy demands. Hummingbirds use 12 times oxygen 12 times faster than a pigeon and 25 times faster than that of a chicken. It'll eat 100% of its body weight. A blue tit will eat about 30% of its body weight, and a chicken eats about 3.4%. The energy demands for birds are incredibly high, and this is in response to flight demand, and maintaining body mass or body condition for flight. There are also a range of different birds have been able to take advantage of a range of different forage types. Everything from your bee eaters, these are 2 bee eaters that are eating a butterfly, a lepidoptera. It looks like the tarantula one in that chicken situation. We've got a golden eagle and a fox, hummingbird, and I'm not sure that that gull is going to have much success with the starfish, but it's giving it an honest effort. But just like the rest of its body, birds have modified their GI system for flight as well. They have a crop and a gizzard. They have lost teeth. Teeth are very heavy. So they got rid of their teeth. And instead, this is why birds eat stone. Stone grinds up in their gizzard, and it helps to digest their food. I also understand that the minerals from these rocks help support their high muscle demands. So neurological function and muscle function require mineralization. And so in order to access these minerals, think about the minerals needed to grow elk antler. Do you know that antler is the fastest growing animal tissue? Where does it get all that bone? Where does it get all that calcium? Last I checked, elk are herbivores. So it has to sequester all of those minerals from store the minerals in its bones, and when it goes to grow the antler, when it's time to grow the end storage, as well as sequester them from, continue to draw them from the environment. When you're thinking about minerals for birds, they need them all the time. They need those minerals all the time, and they need to pull minerals. And so eating deliver those minerals to their bodies. Males have recessed testicles. Females only have one ovum. They have another one that's recessed that can turn on if it needs to, but it's very hard to find. It's like the dot of a pen. They have a cloaca, so they have only one external opening. In fact, only mammals have external reproductive organs. There are pseudo-external reproductive organs in ducks and snakes, but only mammals have true external reproductive organs. Otherwise, they all look like this. It's one external opening. It's for the deposition of waste and for reproductive purposes. Birds don't have urine, they have uric acid. It's the little white part on a poop. So bird poop looks more like that of lizard poop. You've got a black part and a white part, and it's that uric acid, and that is sequestered by the kidneys and excreted. By not having a urobladder, reduces weight. All of these little changes reduce weight. How many people here have an iPhone? There isn't a wall out that you haven't been interested in, I'm sure. iPhones are notorious for bad batteries, but the iPhone was the first one to do away with the plug for earphones. Do y'all remember this? We're like, what are we going to do? We can't plug our earphones into our iPod, pad, phone, whatever it is, iRefrigerator, right? Why did they do that? Made you buy a new one. That amount of space, so they claimed, that was dedicated to the earphone plug was enough space to advance technology leaps and bounds. Just that little space. to be able to put a chip in that could allow the iPhone to do other things. That's how birds work. Just the ability to get rid of teeth, not have a urobladder, only have one functioning testy, only have one functioning ovary. And as Jim was talking about, during migration, to completely shut down on other organs, those small changes make the difference in survival of high energy demand, migration, and other flight functions. Not surprising, the bird skull is also highly adapted. It has dozens of bones that are fused that provide support, but it also has this keratinized bill. And this bill not only functions as a feeding device, but it also functions as a specialized sensor. This is the skeleton of the sword-billed hummingbird. And this sword-billed hummingbird can use, first of all, think about flying with this large object. It works as a sensor. It works as a heat thermoregulator. This is what the sword-billed hummingbirds look like. I don't know if y'all can see them. There you are. The sword-billed hummingbirds, disproportionate size, also helps with their communication. Hummingbirds, as we're finding, are not just great nectivores, but they're insectivores. Hummingbirds will catch small gnats and mosquitoes, particularly when they're trying to build biomass for their eggs, right? You need the protein and the fat in these insects in order to make your eggs. And this gives the hummingbirds the advantage. It can also work as a heat reserve, or it can throw heat. This is the long-billed toucan. And known for its bill, I couldn't have picked a better species. A lot of the sound from the toucan is coming out of, or used as an echo chamber, similar to this amplifier of the bill. The sound I think I really should have used for that is the enchanting rattle of a crow or a raven. If you've ever heard the ravens sit on a fence post and make that rattle, that's all in the nasal rostrum area of the bill. Say that again? How does it make the bill? Oh, so a lot of the sounds that all birds make is a relationship between an organ similar to our voice box, and then they will use their keratinized bill to either as an echo chamber, but sometimes they'll open their mouth like a red-tailed hawk and just scream at you. But the range of different songs comes from a variety. Sometimes it's more of an internal murmur. So this is what makes a bird, right? We've gone from evolution. We started with a fish, which is a vertebrate, and we moved through to tetrapods. We spent a minute looking at amphibians. We thought about being tetrapods, pentadactyl, 5 digits, 4 limbs. We got rid of those digits. We became a snake for a little while. We moved into birds, feathered, flighted, and we've moved through the systems that have adapted in order to support this flight. We've come a long way. I spent a little bit of time thinking about the diversity of birds. There's some thought of old world and new world. No better example of that is of the vultures, which aren't actually related other than both being birds. You can find similar examples with parrots, with nectivores. New World, which is the Americas, has hummingbirds. Old World has birds with an elongated tongue. the bee eaters. And trying to go through all the different kinds of birds is rather daunting. And so I want to bring this back. I want to give you the skills to learn more on your own about your favorite bird species. And think about the distribution of birds. So when I was finishing up with the paleognats and the ground-dwelling birds, I realized the relationship between birds and their distribution is really grounded in the environmental conditions. So here we have, on the left, we have a species range map of your ground. You've got your ostriches, your rays, your emus. And here, we have a global climate distribution. And so we get more climate variation at the top than we do at the bottom hemisphere. And so this is thought to be why a lot of these ground-dwelling birds are more prominent, or actually prominent in your paleognats in the southern hemisphere. Because the habitat, within reason, is far more stable. They don't have the same need to fly. I'm not saying that none of the birds in the southern hemisphere don't need to fly. I'm saying that if you don't need to fly, the southern hemisphere is where you want to be. And that change in habitat is what drives migration. And it's been one of birds' greatest evolutionary adaptations, is that they can migrate, that they can fly for 1,000 miles in a stretch, that they can fly for days. That ability to take advantage of multiple habitats is what gives birds their success and their diversity. This is a tundra swan wing. Looks fairly small, all folded up. But when you open it, it's about 2.5 feet long. Can I grab somebody who hasn't volunteered yet and isn't afraid of blood? Come on up. That migration where you can go up to the north and you can take advantage of unoccupied habitat in order to have your young. And then you can move down to freeze out and forage. They're granivores, forage in these areas and take advantage of the lakes as a resting stop. And then move down to California in order to winter and then make the trip back north. And that movement from habitat to habitat ultimately makes birds the successful animals that they are. There are 3 main drivers to migration: temperature, food availability, and day length. So the question is, where are the birds? Well, it's been a colder than average year. And it's been a wetter than average year in California. So all of these drivers have to line up in order for birds to take the trigger to move. And looking at how this evolutionary change, how this drive to move from one place to another gave these birds the success to reproduce is what was part of their evolutionary driver. So I started to look up what is the evolution of the snow goose. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of debate. So there's Jeanette Odinborough's paper looks at 3 different hypotheses of the evolution of the snow goose and where they came from. I'm not going to go through these, but I want you to take note of the fact that there are 3 different hypotheses. One is on behavioral and morphological, right? What they do and what they look like. One of them is based on their DNA, who they're closely related to when they submitted their spit sample to Ancestry.com. And the third one in 2009 is based on new connections of computer biogenetics. And in each one, the position of the snow goose and who they're related to shifts just a little bit. There are 2 major types of geese. We've got about 3 slides left, and then we'll turn it over to questions. There's 2 major types of true geese. There's your Branta and your Answer. These are your dark geese and your light geese. And this is a major division taxonomically. Looking at the answers, gosh, I should have had a witty answer, come back for that. Your snow geese are related to your emperor geese and your grayling goose, and they all take advantage of these northern habitats. And that really brings us full circle back to Choteau. Because as these birds evolved into their specific habitats, ducks and geese and swans take up one habitat, hummingbirds another. Thinking about the evolution of birds, the mighty flight of the snow goose from the Arctic south and back up north crosses the same path as the dinosaurs in this area. And so there's a little part of me that likes to think that their stopover is a visit to their ancestors, taking advantage of similar habitat, similar offerings, similar weather and climate conditions. When I see these birds come through, this is the Ceranops. This is a paper that was published by Chenery and Horner in 2000 and something. Is it accurate, right? In the Choteau, for fossils that were found in the Choteau area, for a bird-like bipedal dinosaur with short limbs and precursors to feathers. And as these snow geese land in this area and walk across the same rock that their ancestors did, there's sort of a snap in time. And there's a lot that we still have to learn about these animals, both their ancestors and the current ones as they move through. So this is where we are now. This is the freeze-out dashboard. We're a little on the low side in terms of migration. It doesn't mean it's any less spectacular. It just means we're in a colder year. The birds are starting to move through, and maybe folks will stay all the way through the week and see as the numbers build. But there's no better place for avian evolution than right out there in freeze-out. We'll wrap up with that and see if we've got any questions. You're actually correct. When I talk about the same habitat and the same environmental conditions. So she's talking about how the environment here, date back several epochs. It was more tropical. There was an ocean here at one point. And so when I talk about the same habitat, the same conditions, I'm sort of romanticizing it a little bit. I apologize. But yeah, so there were, the climate was different. There was a lot more vascular non-seeding plants. So you had a lot of things were actually very different. But I think about everything, this area dried out and got colder, the dinosaurs then evolved into snows. I hope that, and I'm doing a linear evolution, which is not accurate. Again, I'm romanticizing it.
One is the theory of how bats spend a lot of time watching bighorn sheep, and they can scale predators into tiny food and things like that. So it's something you can see.
Okay, so evolution of bats' flight and the evolution of birds' flight. As of now, that's a great question. So as of now, the evolution of bats, birds, and insects all have flight. I don't know if you all can see this image here. The majority of the flight feathers from a bird comes off of the ulna. Right? So the ulna is this bone that connects your pinky to your elbow, and that's where your flight feathers are. Is from that bone. The skin from a bat connects from the base of their tail all the way out to their thumb, and so it's more. Forgive me, I like to play charades a lot. So it's more of a, if you think about something like this, or a hang glider, right? A hang glider is going to hold open like that. And then you have evolution of flight in insects, which is a protrusion off of their spine. They don't have a spine. It's like a spine. And so it's convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the development of similar traits in different species in response to similar environmental conditions. Like the fin of a shark and that of a dolphin. Dolphins did not evolve from sharks, but they both evolved their dorsal fin. And we have a Labrador with the webbed feet, right? They didn't evolve from ducks, but their feet work in very similar ways. They were bred specifically for the webbing of their toes, and their evolution of bats is thought to have occurred more like the original hypothesis of bird evolution. They're in the trees, they fall out of the trees, they go, ah, and they don't die, right? If they're alive, they get to do it, and then they have young. And so that skin connection evolved in response to their ability, and more like flying squirrels, to go from one branch to another, not really falling out of a tree. Interestingly enough, bats also have a protrusion on their sternum that helps with the attachment of pectoral muscles for flight. The big debate between bat people and bird people is powered flight, that the peregrine falcon is the fastest animal in a dive, but bats have been clocked as the fastest power flyers. And so many bat people will take that claim that bats are the fastest flyers, not peregrines. Other questions? I'm not even sure how we are in time. So that took about an hour and a half. Hopefully I haven't put anybody into a state of misery. Give a faculty a microphone and an unlimited amount of time. How about questions back here? Okay. All right. Well, thank you to my helpers. I really appreciate it. If anybody would like to see this specimen, you're more than welcome to come on up. I'm happy to entertain questions one-on-one, and I believe that Jim is going to take over. Oh, the last Gary Larson cartoon? Yes, let's go back and take a look, because it says early place to see mermaids. Humans evolving back into the water. You gotta believe in mermaids somehow. All right. Well, yeah. So the question is, how is losing your teeth better than having a gizzard full of rots? What I envision happening, evolution over time, is that as the jaw structure changes and modifies, there's less and less room for tooth socket forming, for teeth to really be socked in there. There are actually three types of teeth in sockets, and we see it with crocodiles. I'm going to just show this, if I can get an image. So crocodile teeth don't actually have a formal root in the way that our teeth do. So if you start from there and you get fewer and fewer teeth, and you're working on flying sort of simultaneously, as these body systems randomly change and flight gets randomly better, this is where, it's not that the teeth suddenly disappeared. It's that this one had fewer teeth and that one had smaller teeth, and slowly the teeth evolved out of existence in time. As the animals are foraging, they would have less dexterity to collect whatever they're eating and would collect those stones. Meanwhile, this is making them better and better flyers. Now, the advantage of the stones versus the teeth is that teeth are very heavy, and once you really get just a few stones in there, a handful of stones, the weight of the stones is going to be less than that of the teeth. The other thing is that there's that drive for the mineralization to function with neurology and muscle. Not being a bird that's evolved, that's really sort of the best lineage. With any evolutionary change, there, in most cases, micro changes over many generations. And so, when it wasn't working, that individual was weeded out. If you go back to that variation in population produces more than can survive, and those that do survive go on to reproduce. When the design didn't work, they didn't reproduce. So only when it was most efficient did they make that difference. And you have to think about animals as a calorie by calorie existence. It really is. A chocolate chip has about 25 calories in it, not chocolate chip, chocolate kiss has about 25 calories in it, and that's what a preemie human runs on at about 8 weeks premature. About 25 to 30 calories a day. It's very minimal. And so those very small calorie changes, when you're flying 1,000 miles, birds literally drop out of they run out of calories. And so when you have those small changes that take advantage of those calories, it helps them get to where they're going.
Can you speak a little bit to the evolution of the neurology and migration of birds?
So that's a hard one on my end. The migration of birds and neurological response is a whole field of study that is still nascent in its discovery. And so, like, what was Jim, I don't know if you were there last night, Jim was talking about how it's thought that birds can actually see magnetic fields. Understanding migration sort of takes this leap of faith, and you have to envision and assume, because we can't do what they can do. And so our own limitation of knowledge is based on our experience. And then we have to just trust that it's going to happen, or that it happens. And so the neurological function of birds, just like we go in and out of different states, you think about an athlete, that's just adrenaline is pumping through and focusing on something. It's thought to be a similar state that birds get into this sort of like comatose driven, or like I also think about animals in their breeding state, that they have just one drive. And hormones are amazing. They really drive everything. And so whether it's testosterone or melanin or adrenaline or oxytocin, all of those things kind of take over. And that's what's happening right now when it's still cold and there's not a lot of forage, but the day length is getting longer. Are the animals' estrogen, testosterone, and really importantly, luteinizing hormone, which takes an egg and it makes it mature, is driving these birds. So eventually, one of these migration drivers is going to take over. I'm not exactly answering your question, but it's, if you can get into that concept of this drive of hormones, and match that with the bird's ability to do things we don't even have a clue about. That's kind of where I am.
Yeah, I wonder about the rate of extinction of those species as those species become available to be killed by something. And I'm wondering, are natural selection going to take up the void as species become extinct? Is something going on to replace them, or is it just simply losing species en masse to the detriment of diversity and the fauna?
So my answer is yes to all of that. And that's a great question because species are plummeting. And things like the Christmas bird count, getting out there and everybody counting what they can see all in one day, right? That really gives us a great estimate of what's out there. And also using eBird and iNaturalist, and the more counts we can get, the better assessment we'll have. All of our understanding of bird populations, many wildlife populations, is based on estimates. Mark and recapture. You capture this one, and tomorrow you capture 3, and then you can sort of assess what might be there. But something like, if you think about the not sparrowhawk, the grasshopper hawk that was, again, were you there part of Jim's talk last night? As bird habitats change, it's not just the loss of something like beachfront property or development. It's also, like the Florida scrub jay feeds its young larvae at a certain point. And if the larva hatch and the bird hatch is asynchronistic, the birds die. So it's habitat. Think about habitat not just in a place to sit and nest, but habitat in available food or appropriate temperature or mate choice or juvenile wintering grounds. And that's why the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is so important, because the Migratory Bird Treaty Act connects it's an international law that connects a number of countries, and we agree on protecting birds across these countries and across these habitats. It's what we use in our ice melt that runs, it's the crazy amounts of fertilizers and pesticides that we put on our grasses that kill the insects, and the flowering forbs that limit the amount of forage. It's a sweeping change that humans put their desire on the landscape, and that's really when you go out there and you count the trees, or not sure, but the maple, the red maple, is being planted further and further west because we like red trees. They're not native here. And that has changes to the biodiversity. That has trophic level cascades that impact everything from our insects and our soil microbes all the way up to our bald eagles. And in some cases, we're going to have some species that kind of fill in that gap. The urban pigeon, I argue that the urban pigeon is filling in that gap of biomass. You need biomass. You need animals. You need body material. We're going to have some species become more dominant. Evolution is always happening, so new species are always being formed, but it's only up to humans to decide what a species is and isn't. I took a minute to figure out let me really define duck. Right? And it's a water bird with a shorter neck than a goose. I'm like, who gets to decide when the neck? And so I gave up. I was like, forget it. I'm not going through in front of a group of people to define a duck. But that's how we define species, is just like what the paper was looking at, the morphological characteristics. Is it a species? Is it not? Is it a new one? When does that happen? And that moment really isn't as punctuated as these models, these graphic pictures make us think it is. It's slow over time and multiple generations and reproductive opportunities. And then somebody goes up north and finds that there are hybrids between brown and white bears because that genetic barrier is still porous. And so maybe speciation didn't happen. Speciation is defined as a group of varied individuals who recognize each other as viable mates and can produce fertile offspring. The bears are just like, hey, you're cute. I think we're up for both. I think new species are certainly going to evolve. I sure hope that process continues. I think that existing species are going to fill in those gaps, and I think overall the biodiversity is going to drop. But what we can do on our day-to-day basis is really important. So. I'm happy to take other questions outside of the microphone. Give out a 5-minute break, and then I'm going to turn it over to one of our trusty volunteers.
I hope you guys all learned as much as I did. That was extremely informative. Up next, we are going to have Jim Robbins. He is a scientific wildlife journalist. He spoke last night, and when I asked him what he's going to be talking about today, he said everything I didn't talk about last night. So we're going to have a lot more from Jim. But he needs a few minutes to set up, so go ahead and get a bathroom break if you guys need to, and he'll get going in just a few minutes. Okay?
We went into the office and freeze out. We're in the biologist.
I didn't pick her either. I just want to play.
Because, but he had a presentation on research. People probably do that. They were there at 6:30.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Well, they snare as many birds with the wet. The water's frozen. It's got a lot of open water. And that's why this is such a phenomenon. It's that, you know, this is all the snow geese go to freeze out, but not all of them. But they you know, the population kind of they not scattered out across the landscape. And you know, the Scoobies, numbers are good because they've adapted the human environment to in a different way that these grain fields, and that's what they do. Yeah, no, I think grasslands, suburbs, but yeah, take a look. I'm gonna go check out my dog. What's that? You know, he's big. No, well, he's right, but he's lean. He's got a lot. Well, he has two dogs because he has a dog man. Yeah, sometimes you're right. So we actually do that. You know, we had our well and great. So I think he's got a much better life. No, I would have, you know, it's a different paradigm. But having
I have pictures of you with the feathers. I want to see your mama.
Hey folks, we just want to let everyone know, since we're kind of running a little later, we're going to go ahead and do the raffle items before Origins talk. So we're going to be doing that right now. So everybody make sure you got your tickets out and you'll look your clothes.
well, you know, so that's the domestication. Yeah, a cow gestate every 28 days. 21 days. You know, wild animals. Or, I mean, cycle. She's just off the set. March and April. Yeah, no, that's true. So that's pretty wet soil. Is it bare mud? Bare grass?
Alright, everybody, we're going to start recording these raffle items. First up, we've got the swag bag from our Town Wildlife Foundation. set that aside for now and do that again a little bit just to see. All right, we've got a print Northern Pintails at Breeze Out. This ticket is 309229. 309229. We're going to move on to the next one and come back to that. All right, this one is Ducks Unlimited Yeti mug and cap. Ticket 309207. All right, we have a winner. Next up, we've got the Vortex Binoculars. This is the big one, huh? One of the big ones. All right, so it's 309484. 309484.
See you later, Nick.
309484. All right, we're going to come back to that. We've got a Ducks Unlimited cooler, hat, and cup. So that is 309403. 309403. All right, another winner.
Do I have to show you? No, I believe you. I'm looking forward to that cooler. Thank you.
Base camp. How about base camp? 308680. Winner. Okay, this is another Ducks Unlimited Yeti mug and hat. 044780. All right, over there. All right, we've got 2 one-day passes to Red Owens Pants Music Festival. 308648. 308648. All right, 308648. All right. All right, next up we've got a Jim Mayhem photograph. This is going to be 308681. 308681. All right, up next we've got a blue pine wine basket. 3 bottles of wine. All right, that's 309524. 309524. All right. All right, we've got the second pair of Vortec binoculars. 309367. 309367. All right, we've got a handcrafted amber lamp by Kevin Heinley. Three zero 9368. 309368. All right, we are circling back around. So one more time on this Montana Wildlife Federation swag thing, we have ticket 44653. 44653. All right, we're going to draw a new ticket. Three 9417. There we go. All right, we're back to the Craig Miller photo, pintail duck. That was ticket 309229. 309229. All right, we're going to draw another one here. 308670. 308670. All right. All right, last chance on this original ticket for the Vortec binoculars. 309484. 309484. All right. Three 9492. 309492. We must have had a lot of ticket holders take off.
What was the number again? What's your number?
it's not so empty.
All right, folks, first I wanted to say something about Stella's comment that sometimes you have to believe in romance.
That's right. Go sip and dip.
So I've been asked to fill in here for this, and I'm kind of adapting. I'm adapting like Stella's daughter. And I'm happy to do this. I have other things in my primary presentations, and I'm going to jump around a little bit with some of the last night. So bear with me, I'm a little more free form than last night. I'm going to give you both barrels of the Jim Robbins experience. But don't worry, I'm using copper-coated business shot and not lead shot. Yeah, can we turn the lights on? There we go. Remember when I get through this presentation that journalists don't have answers, they just ask questions. I'm pretty good at that, but I don't want to be able to think that I have answers to the questions that I'm asking. That makes sense. For those of you who weren't here last night, the theme of my talk was we are alive within mystery by miracle. There's so many things we don't know about the world. Stella referenced that, I referenced it last night, and I think we always focus on the things we do know, but we don't focus on the things that remain a mystery. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and some of the ones that I didn't talk about last night. I talked about how birds are dinosaurs, and Stella spoke eloquently to that. I'm going to move along through this part of the talk. Talked about Australian brush turkeys last night and how they are what's called super precocial. Precocial birds are birds or ground nesters that can catch insects and escape predators early in their life, the first few days. Birds that are super precocial can run faster and climb better than the adults on the first day of their life. Australian brush turkeys are super precocial critters that live in Australia, as the name suggests, and they are really one of those miracles of bird evolution. This came from so I talked about how people interpret birds. It's a flight lab in Missoula, which is well known, renowned for its work on how birds fly and what it takes to fly, and looking at the design of birds to apply to aircraft and other things. But the hummingbirds are my favorite thing at the bird lab. And they're placed in a wind tunnel going about 30, 35 miles an hour, and they're blowing up with a big fan and blowing here at about that speed. And there's a bird feeder for the hummingbird at one end. And in order for that bird to remain in the feeder, with its beak in the feeder, it has to fly about 30, 35 miles an hour, which it does quite easily. But then they can watch this bird fly, take high-speed video, and slow it down and understand about the dynamics of how a bird flies. And this picture here, kind of a heat map of a hummingbird. Those hot yellow areas are where the bird is warmest. And then it shows you where the bird is exerting the most energy when it flies. And they can study energetics and other things in the wind tunnel. One of the interesting things, I talked yesterday about Hudsonian godwits and how they're rewriting a lot of the science because they can do things that science didn't think they could do. one of those things is to fly for 7 or 8 days or longer without any food or water or resting. And the previous model for the energy expended by a migrating bird, they thought, all the models said, well, after 3 or 4 days, the caloric intake is such that they'll conk out. Well, these birds fly for 7, 8, or 9 days, night and day, flapping the whole time. And so they have to rewrite the whole energetic model for birds because it doesn't make sense based on the models. And that's what they're doing now, is the scientists are studying these kinds of things. They're trying to come up with new ways to explain what these birds are doing. So I talked about interpretation of birds. One of the ways we interpret birds is through as sentinels. And birds can tell us about what's going on in the world. And birds have a long history of serving as sentinels. Everyone's heard the saying, canaries in the coal mine. Well, miners in Butte, among other places, many other places in England and Wales, used to take birds, canaries, into the mines as a sentinel for methane. And if the bird fell off its perch or died, they knew that the methane levels were getting high and it was time to get out of the mine. So that's one way a bird serves as a sentinel. And this was a handy device so you could reuse your canary. You put it on the perch, and when methane levels got high and it fell off the perch, you could turn on the oxygen cylinder after you got out of the mine and reuse the canary. So it's like a rechargeable battery or something. So how are birds being used as sentinels these days? Well, it turns out that I talked about all the research that's being done at the University of Montana on birds. One of the top researchers there is now an emeritus or retired, is named Richard or Dick Hutto. I don't know if anyone here went to school in Missouri, but he's amazing. You walk amongst the birds, and every bird that makes a noise, he knows exactly what it is right away, and he answers them. It's quite incredible. But one of his delights is to study black-backed woodpeckers. And black-backed woodpeckers are a species that is an obligate burned forest species. They only occur, he said he's never seen them anywhere else, so I would say only occur in burned forests. And they've grown this black back in order to blend in with burned trees, charred trees. And they feed on something called a fire chaser beetle. And fire chaser beetles have this physiology that allows them to detect smoke from miles away. And once the forest is burning and starting to cool, these beetles will come in, because there's no bark on a lot of the burned trees. They can burrow right in and just go to work, start feeding and reproducing. And then these black-backed woodpeckers come in and feed on fire chaser beetles. And this, because they have black backs, they're less likely to be seen by peregrine falcons or other predators that would kill them. And so it's a nice image of how things work. Fire chaser beetles, by the way, used to show up at baseball games back when everybody smoked, because everyone was in the stands puffing away and it made sense to cigarette smoke. And so the premise, Nick Hutto's premise, is that and it's true, the science supports this, we need to have burned forests in order to reset the clock or reset the forest so that it starts to grow again, it renews itself. Because when you have a forest that burns in the next few years, you get a burst of biodiversity. A lot of species that are not present in old growth forests. Old growth forests are very static, they don't have a lot of biodiversity generally, and so you want to have that reset with forest fires. And because black-backed woodpeckers are feed only in bird forest, he counts black-backed woodpeckers, and if their numbers are going up, that means it's good for biodiversity because we have enough forest fire and we're producing enough black-backed woodpeckers. But if they start to go down because there aren't enough fires, they're being suppressed, or if they're selling the logs off right away as soon as the fire comes through, that means that there's not enough renewal of biodiversity. So they become a sentinel for biodiversity, essentially. And then you can start looking at what else might be going on. But Big Choteau travels all over the West, or used to the Northern Rockies, counting the number of black-backed woodpeckers to see how our biodiversity levels are doing. And there's lots of uses of birds as sentinels. There's on the Clark Fork, we're looking at osprey and chemical levels in osprey, toxins, because they feed on fish that come from the tailings that come down from Butte into the Clark Fork. If the fish get hot levels of lead or any other kind of toxic metal, they can test the feathers of the osprey that feed on the fish and tell what's going on with the river. So this kind of thing is happening all over the world, actually, with birds. They're a really important role as a sentinel. I talked about this last night. I'll talk about it briefly again, but somehow there's a group mind. We were out today. It was had a great bird day out there. We saw, I don't know, tens of thousands of birds, and they flew over us and in front of us, and it was great. Those aren't flocks in the sense that murmurations are, but there is an intelligence to all flocks, and this is an area of much study, how birds communicate, how they tell each other what's going on. People think that have studied the intelligence of flocks to learn more about human behavior. It's called swarm intelligence, and they think it might apply to things like people leaving a stadium, what stops people by. That somehow there's this passage of information amongst crowds that changes behavior. And one researcher ran a swarm intelligence lab in Princeton, studies fish, insects, and birds. So there's a group mind or a meta mind with large groups of animals that is what he is looking at. And he thought that voting was reflected in how swarms behave. That there are people who are convinced of one thing, birds who are convinced of one thing on one end, whether they should migrate or where they should feed or whether it was time for reproduction and breeding. And then there were birds on the other end who thought differently, but the most important thing was the middle and how those birds on each end made their argument. There's some articles over there that I wrote for the New York Times on Hudsonian godwits, and the experts, godwit experts think that, well, a lot of bird experts think this, that birds vote, flock birds vote, and when it's time to leave for the godwits, there's a lot of calling and body language that takes place that tell other birds, essentially, we think it's time to go, or we think it's time to stay for a while longer, or that kind of a thing. And this is an area of much research, exactly how birds communicate, and what they're telling each other, and how this whole group mind thing works. One of the theories about the passenger pigeon was disappeared. In 1914, Martha was the last passenger pigeon in the Cincinnati Zoo. And at one time, those birds used to darken the sky, almost like we saw today with the snow geese. And one theory is that it wasn't that they just wiped them out necessarily. We used to hunt them and stuff them in barrels and send them to New York to restaurants. And, I mean, there were so many of them, no one thought they would ever disappear. Now, interestingly, I just saw a presentation the other day that one person is trying to bring them back by taking DNA from museum specimens and blending it with another kind of dove that's very close to recreate passenger pigeons. But I forgot what my train of thought as I veered off there, but what? Oh yes, some people, experts think, swarm intelligence experts think that the reason that they disappeared was because there weren't enough birds left to have a functioning group mind. That they no longer knew when it was time to migrate. They no longer knew when it was time to breed. They no longer knew any of the things they needed to know to survive. And they were such large, there were flocks that would take a day to go past. I mean, they were so big. There's famous descriptions online of how long it took for some of these passenger pigeon flocks to fly by. Turns out that human brains and bird brains are very similar. They look different. Somebody said human brain is like a layered cake, the bird brain is like a fruit cake. And for a long time, people thought they were very different. But they're so similar that the thinking these days is that they evolved from a single brain 500 million years ago, perhaps, or more. And I interviewed a fellow in San Diego who studies owl brains and other things. And he said that finding the source brain is, he said, the biggest chocolate chip cookie for guys like him is finding that source brain. Whether it came from some sort of a fish or eel or something, but no one really knows where the first brain came from. But all brains, the reptile, mammal, and bird brains, apparently came from the same source, at least that's thinking. Bird brains have, so a lot of times people who want to study human brains can't study them in humans necessarily. Study them in birds. A lot of people who study bird language study language, study bird brains. There's a researcher named Eric Jarvis in New York who studies hummingbird song as a way of studying human language, because gatherings are very similar. And he'll go out, put a feeder out for hummingbirds, and you have to get to the brain within a half hour after the bird sings to know where the pathways are in the brain, to catch the hummingbird, remove the brain, and study these pathways, sound pathways in bird brains. This is in the book, my book. And he is working on trying to create a pigeon that sings. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the song section, but it's interesting how people interested in human brains and language are very close to people who study bird song. There is a leading bird song researcher at the University of Montana, by the way, named Eric Green, who's done some really wonderful work on the language of birds. And he believes that bird language is universal, and not only for other birds, say in Japan, or they've played chickadee language for chickadees in Japan, and they can understand it, they seem to understand it anyway. And he also thinks that other species understand bird language. So who knows? But I had the head of the Macaulay Lab, which is, the Macaulay Lab is at the university, or excuse me, at Cornell University. It's part of the Lab of Ornithology. And they are collecting, there's something like 10,000 birds in the world, and they're collecting all the calls and songs of all the birds globally, and then they're putting it in a limestone cave to keep alive in case something happens. And right now, 30% of the birds out there are threatened. And so they're trying to protect as many of these songs and calls as they can in this very deep limestone, and very deep and safe limestone cave. We'll talk a little bit more about bird brains. Ravens are corvids, and corvids are among the most smart birds. Tuluus is something we see in ravens, and then they even see in some birds, like the Caledonian crow, they see tool use where they give the bird a tool. The bird goes and opens up a box, it gets another tool out, and then goes to another box and gets a third tool. And that idea of tool use and using a tool to get another tool is 3 steps ahead. That's as advanced as it gets, at least as far as they know, in birds. So one of the questions is, how do these birds become so smart? And one of the hypotheses, these are ravens in Yellowstone, by the way, is they call them wolf birds, and they think that they got smart because they evolved, at least in part, with wolves, as they eat meat. And it takes a lot to stay ahead of a wolf. You have to know which one's going to kill you, which one's not, which one's slow, which one's fast. You have to know which other birds are watching you when you get that little piece of heart or intestine, and you hide it. Ravens do a lot of caching of their food, and so you have strong attention and memory skills, and these develop in a large group of birds. That's the social complexity hypothesis. And the largest number of ravens on a kill was documented in Yellowstone, and I think it's something like 135. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But there has been this long relationship between ravens and wolves. And Bernd Heinrich, who wrote a book about ravens, talks about how sometimes ravens will find a kill no one else has found, and then call out for the wolf to come and open it up because they can't do it. So there's this relationship between the two. So it turns out that human speech and birdsong are very similar in the early stages. There's a formula or a description for how it takes place, but babies make their first sounds and they start to babble, and birds do the same thing before they form their own language, which is song. And so people who study human speech study birdsong, as I mentioned. It's a fascinating area of research, and there are plenty of researchers who raise, especially zebra finches, on these and understand how this forms, how this happens. I mentioned that Eric Jarvis is studying the song pathway. He would go out, put out a feeder, and the hummingbird would come in and feed, and then within a half an hour he had to take the brain out and study it, look at it under a microscope to know which pathway had been activated. But his goal, in fact I have a quote from him in here, is to take a pigeon. So the song of a bird comes from the syrinx, which is similar to our larynx, except that both lungs go through the syrinx. The songbirds, by the way, have the fastest moving muscles in the animal world because of the muscles that are needed to create song. So Eric Jarvis is experimenting with using DNA, injecting DNA. He's in New York, I think he's at Rockefeller University, and he is trying to inject DNA into the song pathways of a pigeon, which I don't know if they don't exist or they're dormant, but they have a syrinx, so they have the ability to sing, but they don't sing. Unless someone here has heard of singing pigeon, they coo. So this is what Eric says, and Eric is very well respected in the bird world. He grew up in one of the few African American bird researchers. He grew up in a really tough neighborhood. His father was living in Central Park and was murdered, and he became a dancer, a really well-known, accomplished dancer. And then he said, "No, I want to go into bird research," which he did. Although it is an interesting twist that you're trying to create a song in a pigeon. Here's what he told me. I've rebranded myself as a neuroengineer. If I can figure out how to induce a vocal learning circuit in the brain of a species like a pigeon and get it to learn how to sing like a songbird or imitate like a parrot, why, that would be my holy grail. Well, it tells you a little bit about how the structure is. You've got the hardware of the syrinx, you've got the software of the brain, and he's trying to bring the software up to speed so it can create song. I haven't checked in with him in the last few years to see how that's going. Another interpretation of birds is in the family area. We talked to a guy named Stephen Emlin, who's retired now, but he worked for decades in Africa, studying white-fronted bee eaters, beautiful birds. Take a bee and they whack it against the branch and eat it. But it turns out they live in family groups. And he did a great deal of work on how these families are related and how they work together. And, helpers at the nest, which is a concept of even depending on what's going on with the climate and how much food is available, the children will sometimes stay home to raise the next generation with the parents. And they live in this apartment-like complex of all these holes in the side of a cliff. And they're all there to helping each other out, taking care of each other. They're stepmothers and stepfathers. It's really kind of complicated. But he interpreted these birds, their family life, toward the human, in the human family as well. And he actually wrote papers based on, especially on step-parents' relationship and things like that for therapists who apparently use some of this knowledge gained from bee eaters to counsel their patients or their clients. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'll briefly say that I looked at the extremes of bird behavior. Bird migration on the right is the bar-headed geese. They fly the highest migration of any bird in the world, over Mount Everest or near the top. People that are climbing have seen them up there, heard them. And they do that because they've evolved this special suite of adaptations to be able to breathe oxygen at 20% of the oxygen down below. And at our level, they have bigger wings to go aloft in the thin atmosphere. There's a lot of things that they've done. They have more mitochondria in their cells, and they fly from India to Tibet, I think, over the Himalayas, and because they've evolved such extreme behavior, some people think that they may have been flying this before the Himalayas were formed 70 million years ago, and as the mountains formed, they simply flew higher and higher, little by little, and evolved these adaptations. And at the other end of the world is the emperor penguin, which is about 10 times more than we can do as humans. And we go around down there and catch prey, and one of the things that stood out to me was that they raise their heart rate before they leave to enrich their blood with oxygen, and rises to about 250 beats a minute. When they get down to the bottom of the ocean and they're swimming around catching fish, they lower their heart rate to about 5 or 6 beats per minute. And that's something actually humans can do if they're incentivized. I've written a couple books about the brain and physiology, and they have been able to teach people to lower and raise their heart rate. It's not especially easy to do, but it can be done. And it's quite effective. There's lots of things that we assume we have to live with, actually. I found out when I wrote these books that if we're taught how to do them, muscle tension, heart rate, a lot of things that seem to be autonomic. In fact, the field is called the voluntary control of autonomic responses. If we're taught how to do these things, we can do them. It's really fascinating. We just kind of don't bother to do it. Lowering and raising heart rate is one of them, and I would like to be able to do that, but I can't. I put chickens in here because chickens probably will the most important food sources in the world, chickens and eggs. And it used to be when Christopher Columbus came to the U.S., they brought their own chickens. They had their own food source, renewable food source. They had eggs along the way. You had chickens that grew up into other chickens, and it's probably one of the most, if not the most important food source in the world. When the eggs are, and they're cheap and they're plentiful and they're good protein. Things have gotten kind of crazy, I think, in terms of how they're mass produced in factories. They're everywhere. Chicken is everywhere these days, from Chick-fil-A to McDonald's to Lucky Will's. You can get tacos that are chickens, and it's all a little bit beyond the pale to me. I don't have trouble with people eating meat, but I don't like the factory or the industrial part of it. And the chicken is the most industrialized animal in world history. Something like 10 billion chickens in the United States, and they're raised for meat. The mass production of chicken started with an accidental shipment of chickens to a woman in Maryland who wanted 50 chickens, and she got 500 or something like that. The history's in the book, my book over there, which is for sale over there. But it's interesting. It's interesting history. Chickens are really a fascinating history, and unfortunately, a very dirty history. They're still living with the legacy of, dare I say, chicken shit in Maryland and the Delmarva Peninsula, because that was where the chicken industry was based. And there's layers upon layers of chicken poop, and it's causing nitric acid to flow, or nitrates to flow into the Chesapeake Bay, and caused a lot of problems with the growth of algae from the nitrates, and they're still trying to figure out how to deal with it all. So this is a chicken that probably looked a wild chicken looked like back before it was domesticated. One of the fun parts of the book was going to a place called Mother Pluckers. It's a costume shop in Hollywood. Willie, I don't remember his last name, founded it. He was making feather earrings back in the hippie days. And somehow it evolved into this business where he creates angel wings for Hollywood and chicken suits and things like that. And it was really fun to go there and see all the. I got to try on angel wings, and I looked for the picture in my collection here. I think it's back at home, but I have a nice pair of red angel wings on. And but here, these are Mother Plucker wings here made for someone. But they tell me that feathers, there's nothing like a feather for the look in a costume, the drape they call it. It stands alone in terms of material. Feathers are interesting. Stella talked about wings, and we talked about wings yesterday. Well, what good is half a wing? It means, why would birds have wings in the first place if they weren't going to fly? And so that was always an argument for God must have made those birds, because they wouldn't be able to evolve a wing. Same with the eye. The eye is one of those things. Why would you have an eye that didn't work that evolved into an eye that had vision? God must be at work here. And this really was an argument back in the 1800s. Feathers are one of those things too. In fact, I got a quote from one of the leading feather experts in the country. This is evolution. It says, shit happens with evolution you could never imagine. That was the rest of it. He's a very funny guy, Richard Crum. There's some interview with him in the book. But it's true. The feathers come out of nowhere. They just appear, and they didn't evolve from anything else. And so you have these things that show up, like wings and eyes and feathers, that no one really knows where they came from. And Stella, maybe you know more about this than I. Bluebirds, I think maybe it was the same trip. We went to Hollywood and went to the feathered mother pluckers, and then we went to a winery, and this was really fun, called Spring Mountain Winery in St. Helena, was that where it was? In California, in Napa. And this fellow who ran this winery, his name escapes me at the moment, but the reason I wanted to go there was not just to taste the wine, but he had wondered how to deal with the infestation of blue-green sharpshooters, which will burrow under the bark of wine grapes, the vine, and cause infections. And he had been a vineyard manager for decades, and he had gotten cancer. He'd worked for the Charles Krug winery, and he'd gotten cancer, and the guy he worked with had gotten cancer, and they both thought, well, maybe it has to do with all the stuff, all the shit we dump on the wine grapes. And they decided to look for an alternative. And so they built 800 bluebird houses in this giant wine estate. And sure enough, they asked a scientist, researcher named Julie Jedlicka, to come in to study their use of these bluebirds. And they found that, yes, indeed, these bugs were showing up in the poop. They were capturing the poop, and it was working. And he said it was wonderful. He said they didn't have to spray, or they sprayed a lot less. And they had bluebirds all over the place they got to see and enjoy. And so it was one of those experiments that turned out. It was not related. Well, then he said he wanted to put in owl boxes to control rodents. I think that was his next project, is to get mice and rats that come and chew on vines. And barn owls would be able to come and take care of the rodents. So it's oddly enough, interestingly enough, there was something called economic ornithology many years ago that tried to do this very thing back in the early 1900s. There's some great quotes from the literature in the book about that. But when DDT came along, they realized they didn't have to use birds anymore to do the work. They could just spray everything. We know how that turned out, right? One thing I don't have a slide, but one thing I wanted to mention along these lines is I interviewed a guy who runs a company called Falcon Force in California. And he travels with his, and you can Google this, there's some beautiful pictures of his birds on his website. And he travels with peregrine falcons, trained peregrine falcons, and Eplomotto falcons, which are gorgeous birds from South America, and other falcons. And he travels to the fruit country, wine country of California, and uses these birds and flies them above the grapes during what's called veraison, which is when the grapes are starting to turn purple and the birds come in and try to steal them. And they keep those birds from landing and taking the fruit. And he also uses them for cherries and other fruit. And but one of the more interesting uses of Falcon Force, as this company is called, is he takes them to San Diego, to SeaWorld. And there's a roller coaster there called the Manta Ray. And the birds come in from the ocean, the gulls, and they sit on the rails. And when the roller coaster comes, all the birds fly up. And people have gotten hit in the face and injured by the gulls. And so he takes his birds there during the peak of the season and flies them to keep the gulls away, so people don't get slapped in the face by the gull. I don't know how hard gulls are, but I bet if you get hit by the beak, it would hurt. Stella talked about evolution, and I thought one of the most interesting things that I know about evolution is that it led, partly what led to Darwin's ideas about evolution, natural selection. He raised, and there's a chapter about this, I think, in Origin of Species, one of his writings. He raised what are called fancy pigeons. And fancy pigeons are the ones on the left. And those are birds that people have taken from the bird on the right, which is a common pigeon, and bred to become these really extraordinary looking creatures. And this has been going on for a long time in Europe and other places, in the 1800s. But people still raise them. I talked to a bunch of gang members in California who got involved in fancy pigeons and racing them. There's one called, I think, a short-faced tumbler that flies and does somersaults while it's flying. A lot of interesting stuff in the world of fancy pigeons.
Supposedly, people kill the hawks before they fly those ugly pigeons.
Oh, really? I haven't heard that.
Because they got a neurological problem.
Oh.
Prey, so.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to tuck that away. I came out of my office one time. My office is in downtown Helena, above the Parrot, if anyone's been to Helena. And I went down the alley behind my office. I came out, and there in the alley was a merlin feeding on a dead pigeon, and just ripping out its breast. And it's one of those urban ecosystems where the merlins come in when the pigeons are roosting and take them out in the middle of the city. Where? So one of the interesting things that I did when I was doing the book was I got to spend time with Denver Holt. I did a piece for the Times, New York Times, on him, and he runs the Owl Institute north of Missoula in Charlotte. And John Fitzpatrick, when I interviewed John Fitzpatrick, who was head of the Cornell lab, I said, I wanted to talk to you about Denver Holt. He said, Denver Holt? He said, he's Mr. Owl. And so it was really an honor to go out with Denver and catch long-eared owls. We went out near Missoula and put up nests. I don't know, has anyone here ever captured owls? It's really fun. So you go up to the top of this draw, and there's brambles and stuff and where they're nesting. And down below, you put mist nets across the trees. And then you go up above and you walk down. And as you walk down, the birds flee their nests and they fly into these mist nets. And then they go up to the nest, up to the net, and you just unwrap them. They're very quiet and docile. And so we captured a couple, and they banned them, studied them. There's been a countrywide, in North America, there's been a real decline in owls, a lot of different species, and that's one of the things they're looking at here. They're not sure why that's happening. Denver, his belief is that owls are popular, especially with people, because they look like us. Unlike other birds, they have a face, and they have eyes like us facing forward, looks like hair on top, a nose. And one of the other things he told me is that those dish-in faces like ours have, it's kind of a satellite dish for sound. I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of the owl imprint in the snow, where the owl has gone in and grabbed mice from beneath the snow. It's because they can hear what's going on below the snow. They can't see it, but they can hear it. The other thing owls have is they have this special ridge of feathers along the front edge of their wing, so that it allows for silent flight, and so the prey can't hear them coming. Death from above. I mentioned this briefly last night. Police chief in Washington, D.C. said they were looking for a little girl who had been murdered, and they were looking like for a grave, essentially, in some of the parks. And she asked the fellow who owned this bird, whose name is Challenger, if he would bring the bird down to cheer people up. And the police rushed the bird down to the park, and they took Challenger out of his cage in the back of a van, and all these police cadets got a up close and personal look at this bald eagle. Birds, we don't maybe think about it as much in Montana, but birds looking at birds is definitely a transformative experience, even in Montana. I tried to get at why that is. It's hard, but there's a lot to it, I think, and I think that people got interested in birds and bird watching during the pandemic is not I think there's a good reason, partly because they're outside, but I think birds lift our spirits. I think birds definitely are a symbol of transcendence, and so people, it's part of the reason people watch birds. I talked about bird migration last night. We saw some of that today. We don't know how, for as much work as they've done, they don't know how birds manage to do what they do, how they migrate, whether it smells or celestial cues like the moon and sun and stars. One of the experiments they did on bird migration was they took a bird to the planetarium and they put it in an open cage and they put it on a seat and they turned on the stars and they put ink on the bird's feet and they could see when certain constellations appeared, the bird would leave footprints going up the side of this cage with the paper. It was lined with paper, and they could tell which constellations the bird was oriented to. Actually, the guy who did that research was Stephen Emlin's father, who did the work with the white-fronted eaters. So bird migration is one of those things that's still a mystery. Lots of things about birds are mysteries. Here's something that Ken Nile, who used to run the Bird Lab, said. Birds can do spectacular things. They can go from 40 miles an hour to zero and land on a branch that's moving all in a couple of seconds. We can't come close to doing that. And that's really something to think about. I mean, you watch a bird land on a willow or something, and how fast they're going and they immediately stop. One of the things that they're doing with aircraft is trying to build that, what they call morphing into aircraft. So the reason a bird can do that is it can change its shape. Most planes have rigid wings, and they fly, and they don't change their wing shape or their wing position, but they're designing aircraft now based on how birds can morph their body and their wings to get better performance. And that's one of the things that about aircraft design that's come from birds. The other thing that's come from birds is you notice on some planes the wings go out and there's a little upturn at the end. That's really important. That makes the wings much more efficient, and that came from you see raptors and stuff or eagles that fly with that little curvature at the end. We talked a little bit about water yesterday. We talked about the things that we don't know. We talked about how water is a mystery, still a mystery. Another interesting thing I think is really important and we know a little about is how forests and grasslands and other areas affect the weather. And the Amazon, for example, generates weather all over the western United States and South America, yet we know almost nothing about what's called the bioclimate. We talked about viruses and how 800 million viruses a day are falling on every square meter of the planet and become incorporated into human DNA, that become part of us. This is a story I wrote in the New York Times a few years ago. Researchers recently identified an ancient virus that inserted its DNA into the animals that were human ancestors. A snippet of genetic code called ARC is part of the nervous system of modern humans and plays a role in human consciousness. Between 40% and 80% of the human genome may be linked to ancient viral invasions. I think that's pretty incredible. I mean, who's ever heard of viral ecology? But it's a big part. I mean, it's a huge part of who we are in the world around us. So attention, here's another thing we know very little about. I've written a couple books about the human process of paying attention, which is really important these days because attention is what everyone is after. If you ever look at Instagram, or you ever look at Facebook or Twitter or all those things, what they really want, they talk about they want eyeballs, but they don't want eyeballs, they want attention. And attention is a critical part of our culture globally. And we don't understand how it works. We don't understand what it does. ADD, ADHD, those attention deficit, attention deficit hyperactivity, anxiety, depression, all part of the system of attention. Again, this is one thing that we don't understand about ourselves and our own physiology. And so there's a saying that what we see is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. I mentioned questions when I first started. I think the questions that we ask are really important because there's a lot going on in our world today that is causing some serious problems. Here are some of the questions I would ask. So I really wanted to talk about about it in my book in other places, but it turns out there's a field of ornithology that studies how indigenous cultures relate to birds. And we have our own science here in this country, in Europe and other places, the Western science. But there is a kind of indigenous science out there that studies birds and knows how to relate to birds in the world around us. The group, one of the people I focused on, in Ricardo Rossi, and he was writing a multi-ethnic bird guide based on work that he'd done with the Yagan people in southern Chile. And in fact, the last native speaker of Yagan just died. Her name was Christina Calderon. She died about a year ago. She was the last of the people to speak and understand as first language Yagan. And they in order to preserve the language, they asked her to tell bird stories. Birds are important to almost every culture, including our own, but indigenous cultures for food, for spiritual reasons, cultural reasons, and some cultures believe they're relatives. So everyone pays attention to birds. And so the bird stories are really important to people in these cultures. So they asked her to tell her bird stories as a way of preserving language. And she did. And she told these wonderful stories. And she died, but they put a lot of them side by side with the Western science in the multi-ethnic bird guide. And there's at least a couple other of these multi-ethnic bird guides being written in order to preserve both indigenous knowledge and indigenous science around birds and Western science. And I think that's an important thing. I have a quote in my book from a National Geographic explorer in residence named Wade Davis. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. First, here's a quote from Ricardo Rossi, who was doing the work with the Yagan. He says, "The Yagans see birds as living beings with an intentionality and interest in life. They are not just passive objects, machines for producing meat. Lamentably, however, that is how birds are seen by many. By culturally encountering the birds, though, we can have a better life and the birds can have a better life. To the Yagan, birds are companions and teachers very much." Hang on one second. I really want to find this Wade Davis quote because I think it's one of the more interesting quotes in the book. Here's something I thought was interesting. Birds are a way to teach us. This is not Wade Davis, but I will get to that. This comes from the field of ethno-ornithology. And this is the guy who founded the field of ethno-ornithology as a way of bringing people into the natural world through birds. They're coming in through the bird window, I call it. He said, he's talking here about kids that they have in college and in school. He said, half of our first-year students in biology can't name 5 British birds. 20% of them can't name 1. His name was Andy Gosler, and he founded the field of ethno-ornithology. It's a common story around the world. When you say, did you know that this species has declined 70% in the UK in 20 years, it means nothing to them. They say, why should I care? I didn't know that bird existed until you told me about it. But when you take people bird banding, and that means, taking them out to capture birds and put bands on them, and put a bird in their hand, it is a life-changing experience for them. And that's part of what I see going on here. You bring people out into the field to have these giant flocks of birds fly over them like we did today more than once. It's a life-changing experience, especially for young people who may have never heard of anything like this. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to come here and talk, is because I think these kinds of field experiences, getting people away from their iPhone and their computers and what have you, are critical. I mean, those are cool technologies, and here we are in the middle of this glorious environment and seeing these birds, and I think it's really a way of kind of waking people up to what's going on in the world these days, and hopefully it'll translate to some change. So here's what Wade Davis had to say. I saw him speak. He came to Helena, and I'd read most of his books, and he's really good. But in terms of ethno-ornithology and the indigenous world and what's out there, he spent a lot of time studying that. He says this. He calls the constellation of native cultures who have accumulated wisdom and learned to thrive in the landscape for generations the ethnosphere, where the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, myths, ideas, inspirations, intuitions, brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. It's a symbol of all that we are and all that we can be as an astonishingly inquisitive species. These myriad perspectives manifest in language, which is not merely vocabulary, he writes, but, quote, a flash of the human spirit, the vehicle by which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of spiritual possibilities. I got a lot out of this chapter on ethno-ornithology. One of the other favorite parts of it was talking to a fellow, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but he studied this tribe in Indonesia that made song maps about birds. And they had a map in their head of the territory where they lived, Basabi, that's the name of the tribe, the Basabi. And they would, when someone died, they would take a bird flight, an imaginary bird flight over the territory and describe the territory where this person lived, where he gardened, where he hunted, and where she lived, and fished, and they would create a song map with poetry and song, and every person who died got one of these song maps made about them in their life. And they plotted all of these points, all of these things that people talked about in these songs, 17,000 different points on a map. None of them overlapped, they were all independent, so they created, culturally, all these people have created this incredibly creative imaginary map of the territory. And that's the kind of thing where I think studying ethno-ornithology and how people relate to birds is really important, because there's so many different ways of being in the world. We can't imagine what it's like for the Basabi or the Yagan or any of these people to see the world through their eyes and the ways that they have evolved over the millennia. And then some of the things that the things that I got interested in, not necessarily related to birds, but I came about because of my work on birds, was that there's something, my prediction is some of these things we will discover in the coming years. The guy who's the head of the Brain Research Institute in Seattle, Christoph. He's an expert in human consciousness. And this was from an article in Scientific American. He made an argument for universal consciousness. Panpsychism is what we call it. That everything has a mind. And certainly those things that are most advanced, those creatures in the world besides humans that are most advanced, like birds, they have families that raise their young, teach, use tools, teach other birds to do things. They're probably candidates to have something along the line of a soul that humans have. But we shouldn't think of humans, we've been living in a system of human exceptionalism, even though we probably don't think about that. But there are people challenging that notion these days, and I think that's a good thing. I think it will change our relationship with the natural world. And he said the single most elegant and parsimonious explanation for the universe I find myself in is panpsychism. And I think there's something to that. And I learned that from my research on birds because the other thing I learned from birds was from a woman who's an ethno-ornithologist who studies several different tribes, one in Paraguay and a couple of others. And she found that there were some tribes that were able to move their consciousness out beyond their body to sense the world, to sense the landscape, to sense animals, to sense each other. And she said it's not only does it happen, she says it's quite common. You see it in most of the hunter-gatherer groups. An extremely developed skill base of cognitive agility, of being able to put yourself into a viewpoint perspective of many creatures or objects, rocks, water, clouds. We as humans have a remarkable sensitivity, imagination, and ability to be cognitively agile. I think that's true. I think there's something to that. And I think it's also one of those things we'll learn more about as time goes on. And birds, of course. I have a couple of friends who did meditation retreats. And after a week, they come out, and one friend in particular, he was watching birds, and he could feel the bird. He could feel what was happening with the bird, the call, the bird, the flap of the wings. And I think there's something to that. I would like to know if that's true. I think it's something. These are the kind of things questions we should be asking. If there are different ways of perceiving and living in the world. Of course, I think there are, and I think it's an important question to ask. One other element of this is there's a wonderful essay called The Perceptual Implications of Gaia. And what this essay says, it's gotten a lot of attention. It's quite old now, from the 90s, is that we've got perception wrong. And some of these ideas about birds that I came across in ethno-ornithology and talking to people who had these bird experiences. Once you start talking to people who have bird experiences, it opens up a lot of interesting things. But there are people who believe we've got the wrong model for perception. It's based on laboratory work, and we haven't studied it the way we should. And this essay says that perception isn't something that we look at an object, we move from it the way we do. It's an interactive phenomenon. If they had studied perception in nature, they would come to understand the senses not as passive mechanisms receiving valueless data, but as active exploratory organs attuned to dynamic meanings already there in the environment. So what he's saying there is that there's more to our experience of the natural world than we commonly experience. I talked about, kids that go out and don't know anything about birds and they band a bird and it changes their life. I think there's more of that kind of thing out in the natural world for us to learn about. And that's one of the questions I would ask. I have the last quote here is from Carl Jung, who said, "No voices now speak to man from stone, plants, and animals, nor does he speak to them believing they can hear. His contact with nature is gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that this symbolic connection has supplied." So I guess that's my motto. I think we have lost our way in the world with what we've done to it. And I see events like this as reestablishing connection to the natural world. I think people are hungry for it. And I think this is why we're seeing this kind of explosion of interest in birds and other things. And so we'll leave you with that, and if there's any questions, please ask.